Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Grief Support, the Ritual Edition, an event hosted by me, Elisa Forneray, and EOL's Wander community. The Wander community is a space to gather as we all navigate grief. And through Wander, I've been hosting this monthly event along with another monthly series called Griever's Guide to convene leaders and professionals in the death and grief spaces so that audiences like y'all here tonight can feel actively supported as you navigate life after a death-related loss. So again, I am Elisa Forneray. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I am a convener, a consultant, a speaker, and an educator working in the grief space. I got into this work in 2016 after my mom died, and ever since I've been actively working to amplify the resources and work of people like our guest Megan today. You can learn more about my work at the links in the chat that are wonderful. Kaylee is going to throw in, but most importantly, what you need to know about me is that I am here today to serve and hold space for all of you, and also for this wonderful speaker. So a little bit of housekeeping and acknowledgement before we jump into the programming. I personally am operating my business from Kauai and Tonga land, and I am here tonight in acknowledgement of the privilege that I have to be, as always, sitting in this office, in this home, on this earth, in a house that I live in, but on land that I do not own. And if you'd like to learn more about where you're taking up space this evening or whatever time of day it is for you, Kaylee is going to throw another link in the chat where you can learn more about that and look at the land that you're on. Because this is a Zoom webinar, you'll only be able to view the faces of our speaker tonight and me, but I encourage you to interact with us in any way that you choose. You can ask questions in the chat, you can throw them in for the next 40 minutes. We will be doing a short Q&A at the end, so do not hesitate to ask questions, and if we see them popping up throughout and feel compelled or called to answer them, we will. There's also a Q&A feature since this is a webinar, so you can throw them in there and we'll get them passed over to us. And lastly, this is going to be recorded. It's being recorded right now, so you'll be able to find information about that in a follow-up email and on the Wander Community EOL page after. And we'll throw a link there, though. If you have signed up, then you've probably already visited that page or will be getting communications from us after with follow-up materials. So to get into the meat of it, tonight we are going to talk about grief and ritual. And I wanted to have this conversation, one, because I was excited just to talk about the things that we can do that can bring us consistency, peace, processing, opportunities to encompass what it is that we need to be able to sit with our grief, move through our grief, and like I said, process our grief. So we're going to talk about ritual and ceremony, which Megan is actually going to describe and differentiate for us tonight. And, for me, I know that the things that I've done in the past to honor my mom and my loss and my grief have been grounding. They have been enlightening when I really let myself settle into them, and hugely uplifting. So I'm going to introduce Megan, who's here on the screen with me, and then I'll let her introduce herself and we'll get into it. So Megan Sheldon is a cultural mythologist, storyteller, and celebrant, and she's been crafting and convening ceremonies across the life cycle for years and continues to explore the involving nature of ritual with her passion project, Seeking Ceremony. Recently, she and her husband built a mental wellness app called Be Ceremonial to inspire care providers to create ceremonies with their patients or clients. And with a focus on the less visible moments connected to birth and death, she's hoping to radically shift the narratives we hold surrounding grief, dying, and death. We will have thrown all of the links that we have for Megan's work into the chat. And Megan, I want to open by inviting you to start by saying what called you to this work, and how did you end up here having this conversation with me today?
Thank you, Lisa. It's lovely to be here with all of you joining. My feet right now are planted in North Vancouver, which is also the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And interestingly enough, I met Elisa here in Vancouver through our local kind of end-of-life community. And then COVID happened and we've been kind of separated, and she's now in California. But for me, I think that as with many of us, I imagine, I kind of stumbled into this work. I don't think I necessarily even saw it as work until people started offering to hire me and create ceremonies for them. For many years, I ran a brand storytelling studio. So I would work with nonprofits and organizations to help create their story. I have a master's in mythology. So for me, I'm really interested in archetypes and the collective unconscious and how stories connect us across time, across place. And as I was doing all this work, I was convening people together. I was creating space for stories to be shared and told and witnessed. I love the term story catcher. So I was helping people catch stories and then weave them into different narratives. And through that process, I recognized that what we were in fact creating was ceremony. We were creating a ceremonial space where stories could be caught in that beautiful, powerful way. So that was kind of in the background, and then there was also this kind of internal struggle that I was going through. My husband and I got married, and we got pregnant, and then we miscarried, and then we got pregnant again, and we miscarried, and we had 3 miscarriages in the span of a year and a half. And I don't have a religious or strong cultural background to draw from. I'm not overtly spiritual in the sense that I don't practice or belong to one kind of spiritual faith. So let me tell you, it was that grief was dark and deep and very isolating. I had people tell me years later, oh, I wanted to do something, but I didn't know what to say. And so they said nothing. And I think that silence was deafening, and it threw me into a bit of a dark hole. While we were going through this personal kind of invisible loss, which I'll talk a lot about, we were also losing my husband's father to ALS. I learned about the term ambiguous loss and these kind of anticipatory grief. I mean, the day we found out about the diagnosis, we lost a little bit of him. Each month, each year, as we lost more of his body and his kind of presence, and we were anticipating life without him. The grief was so heavy. I felt like I could just like cut through it. It was just this fog I was walking in all the time. And I'm a pretty happy, positive, upbeat person. So to have that kind of darkness around me was, I felt like I had to push it down. That's what society was telling me. That's what the kind of cultural norm was. And so I tried that, and it would just kind of come out like a volcano. So I discovered my own version of what I now call ritual. I didn't think I got to have rituals and ceremonies because I didn't prescribe to any set kind of institution. So I felt quite um, isolated in that way. And then I realized that ritual and ceremony is actually the basis of storytelling and the basis of how we communicate with each other. Albeit I have a very critical lens on with cultural appropriation and only using ceremonies and rituals that come from either my lineage or that I'm creating in the moment to reflect my own experience. So yeah, it started to evolve. I found my way into my own solo ceremonies where I would acknowledge the grief that I was holding, and then I started to convene, bringing people together and holding ceremony space for each other to share and catch each other's stories. And from that, the snowball just kind of started rolling down that hill. And I guess I've just been in that space now for 7 years, and I'm an end of life storyteller now. So people invite me into their family nearing death or after death. And I gather and catch stories from family and friends and weave them together to create the story that we're going to honor. And most importantly, the legacy that people can carry forward. I am a story keeper. I'm the story keeper for my extended family. I've got all of my lineage, all of the letters from my great grandparents from Scotland and Ireland. I hold that for my extended family. So being a story keeper is a beautiful privilege and also a lot of pressure sometimes. So yeah.
I can imagine. That sounds like a lot. No one in my family really holds that role. And I can imagine just the process of collecting, processing, keeping safe as well. Those stories, it must be an incredible privilege. So that's lovely to hear. And one of the things that came up for me as you were talking that I'd like to go back to in the spirit of our conversation today is, first, thank you for sharing vulnerably and honestly about your losses. And it sounds like out of those losses and processing of them, that you started to weave connections between ritual and ceremonies that you could create to, I'll let you speak to it, but to experience that grief in whatever way you needed to. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you define ritual and ceremony and how you came to those definitions and understandings through your own losses and the practices that you started developing.
Yeah, and it's evolving, but my current definition of ritual and ceremony is that ritual is an action that we do with intention, and the intention is often to create meaning. So rather, I think we've talked a little bit about earlier the idea of routine and ritual. Routines are things that you kind of just fall into. They're habits. They're, the way you make the coffee every morning, the way you get out of bed, the way you go to bed, the way you, approach your work day. Those are your routines. To elevate that and turn it into a ritual is when you create that intentional awareness and that acknowledgement that you're hoping to create meaning from that. So I often give the example of you can make your morning coffee the way you normally do and have it be your routine. But if you want to turn that into a ritual, think about every time that you're grinding your beans or waiting for the water to boil, you honor somebody that you've lost, or you acknowledge something that you're holding. You might whisper it out loud to yourself. You might, just place your hands on your heart and just close your eyes and just think for a moment what you're holding that day as your coffee is brewing. And then as you take a sip of your coffee, you might practice a moment of gratitude where you're just, thankful for something that day. So now you've taken the simple kind of habit or routine of making your morning coffee and you've elevated it to that kind of ritual status. So for me, a ritual is typically a standalone occurrence. So it's when I have ritual tools all over the place, and I have places that I go, and I might feel I often think of it like a call and response. If my anxiety is rising, and this past year with COVID, there's been a lot of anxiety. I have 2 small kids at home, a father who's just come through lung cancer. Like there's so much anxiety. And so I know exactly where I need to go in the forest to the special bridge. And it's my ritual bridge. And I drop a rock on one side or the other to acknowledge, one side is kind of all swirly and crazy and chaotic. And then one side, just the way the river bends, is really calm and smooth and peaceful. So I'll pick up that rock and I'll choose in that moment, am I in the chaos or am I in the peace? And that simple act of watching my rock drop down the bridge and plunk into the river, that's a ritual that helps me address what I'm feeling and acknowledge it. A ceremony is when you kind of string those rituals together and create that larger story. You can have a ceremony for yourself. I love solo ceremonies. I think that they're so powerful. You can have a partner ceremony. You can get together with your husband or your child or your mother or your friend. And the 2 of you can kind of step into that ceremony space together. You can create a group ceremony, which is probably the one we're most familiar with, funerals and weddings, baby showers, mother blessings, that type of group environment, where there's often kind of either prescribed rituals that you bring forward, or you invent your own kind of new ones depending on the occasion. And then the 4th kind, which has really popped up this last year and a half, is virtual. So I've hosted dozens and dozens of virtual ceremonies this year, end of life ceremonies, ceremonies for families who went through stillbirth and miscarriage, mother blessings, birthday parties. We step into the virtual environment and we think about how we can take the rituals that we would normally have in person, and rather than just doing them the way we always did, how do we adapt them and how do we invite them into this kind of new space?
Thank you for sharing. Particularly what you shared about knowing you have a place that you go to and you have that bridge, and when something is inside of you and you feel it and you connect with it, I need to go, this is where I need to be. You've created, something that feels significant to you. And my question is, particularly for people who are new to the concept of ritual or ceremony, who weren't, raised with those practices, how do you get to that place of figuring out what is right for you and building those, particularly for people? One of the things that I was curious about that I prompted you with before this conversation is for people who aren't sure where to start when developing or creating something of their own.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I lead a 6-week course called End of Life Rituals, and we cap it at 25 people. We do it every season, and we're in the middle of ours right now. And without fail, every winter or every spring or every summer, when we get our 25 new participants, like at least half of them think and say out loud, I don't know how to create ritual. I don't know how to create ceremony. I don't have any of these things in my life. And within 10 minutes of us sharing and talking, they have these aha moments of like, oh, I do. I have that ritual. I do. I've been part of ceremonies before that are, beyond the traditional moment. I think that for me, what I've had to really do is just extend my idea and open up my idea of what ritual and ceremony needs to look like, and focus on more what it should feel like. I do some weddings. It's not my forte. I am a celebrant, so I do marry people, but time and time again, my number one advice to people is like, don't focus on what it needs to look like. Like, what do you want to feel? Like, choose 3 or 4 words that capture the essence of what you want to feel that day, or what you want your participants to feel. And honing it down to those really simple intentions can just make it feel so much more accessible. We're sold this idea of self-care. We're sold this idea of ritual and ceremony that involves really expensive products, or it involves a lot of planning, or that you need to, hire a celebrant. And my number one passion is to remind people and to like show people that they have the ability already inside themselves to create the rituals and ceremonies that they need. And yes, I have years of experience that I want to share and help you kind of awaken that. But anything that tells you that you don't have what you need and you need to look outside of yourself, I question, because I just think, I come back to the idea of mythology and these stories and the collective unconscious. Like we are ritual beings. It is how we breathe and how we connect and how we communicate. So my hope for people is just to take a pause and notice how they're bringing intention to their actions throughout the day or throughout their grief. I recently, when we lost my father-in-law, he was quite a distinguished looking man. He was 6'5", Swedish, and he had a very kind of gait to his walk and a very like structured kind of shoulders. And it's happened at least 20 times in the last 5 years that I thought I saw him. And I would be driving down the road and I think, oh my gosh, there's Boo. And I would just like catch myself. And then I would snap out of it and say, no, that's not him. Like, close that door. Do not go there right now. You need to get to school to drop the kids off. You need to go to the grocery store. Like, I would just close the door on the grief. And that grief would kind of just linger. So what I started doing a few years ago was I would actually pull the car over, take a minute. I wouldn't go up to the person and talk to them, but I would kind of from a distance look at them and say, hi, Boo, how are you? And I would tell him about our day. He never got to meet his granddaughters. So I would tell them about them, tell him about them, what might have happened that day or that week. Like, Hannah learned how to ride a bike this week. Would be so proud of her. And I take that moment that was a pang of grief, and rather than just shutting it down and suppressing it, I activate it. I step toward the grief that I'm feeling, and I step into it, and I think, okay, I now have my own little ritual of when I think I see somebody who I've lost, rather than ignoring it, I have a conversation with them. So I don't know if that helps open your mind a little bit to what it can be.
That's so helpful. And it's actually making me, I don't always cry. I think this is just one of those days, but I see people that look like my mom. Good. Other people are teary eyed too. I see people that look like all the time. And my immediate reaction, I think, for comfort is to just run away, turn around, not look at the person, because it really freaks me out, especially moving back to my hometown where all of the memories that I have here, my mom was alive. And I think being able to use ritual and slowing down to, it sounds like, and a practice of being intentional about what you're going to use that time and that reaction and that gut feeling for, to be able to connect with your person is just absolutely beautiful. And it's making me not excited to see someone that looks like my mom again on the street, but it is bringing me so much peace to know that there is a different reaction I can have that might feel more settling than running away. That was enough for me to say, great, like we can be done. I'm ready to go. This was so useful. Thank you. I really just am so grateful for that. And it relates to a question that we have. I'm just gonna, it relates to a question that we have from an attendee that popped up in the Q&A, and it was actually in the direction I was gonna go as well. And the question is, I wonder how you guide individuals who are in the early stages of grief to move toward acknowledging their grief and then move toward honoring their grief and loss with rituals. So I'd really love to hear from you. How can we use these, other than what you just shared so beautifully, to connect with our grief, to process our grief, especially if we're early in it?
So there's a few different ways to look at grief, and my co-founder with Seeking Ceremony, Kate Love, she would always talk to me about big T trauma and little T trauma. And as we were having these conversations about grief, she lost her mom 5 years ago, and she would talk about small G grief and big G grief. Like the big G grief were like the losses of the people that are just like part of your everyday, the big, hard, scary things. But then we also have all these small G griefs that happen, right? It's like the anniversary, the first Christmas without them, the birthdays, walking down the street and seeing them. So as you kind of move through your grief journey, you start to recognize those big G moments and the small G moments and find rituals to kind of adapt to them. Then there's a whole other beast, and that's the acute grief stage. That's when you don't have it in you to you don't know up from down, and you're in the swirling chaos and deep feelings of the big G grief. And to go back to a story, because I'm a storyteller, several years ago my brother got really sick and he was on life support, and he's the middle brother, and my older brother and I didn't know what to do. We were in that stage where it was just, there was no up from down. And so we instinctively knew we needed to be together and we needed to walk or hike. Like we had to do something physical where we didn't have to look at each other directly, but we could kind of walk up a mountain. And we live in Vancouver and there's mountains all around. We happened to Google some trailheads and found one called Brothers Creek. So we don't live in the same part of the city, so we both drove and met at the base of Brothers Creek, and we started walking up this mountain. And we didn't talk, we didn't really do much. We just started hiking up. And as we kind of hiked and got, tired and hot and sweaty, and we might have a small little conversation here or there, but for the most part, we did about an hour hike up this hill in silence. And when we got to the top, there was these old growth trees. And, in Vancouver, we have trees that are 600, 700 years old. And there was this grove of 3 trees. There was no other trees kind of in this grove. There was just 3 trees. And my brother and I both like intuitively just found our way to the middle tree and we just placed our hands on it. And it was just like both of our eyes just filled with tears, and we didn't say anything. We just held our hands on there for as long as we needed to. And we just sent our other brother as much like love and whether you believe in the like the transference of energy, for us it was just this acknowledgement of the grief we were holding. There are no words, there was just simple action. And as we kind of turned a corner to come down after that, we stood on this bluff and we could actually see the hospital where he was at from that bluff, which was so odd because we didn't think we were kind of positioned that way. And I've said it before, but I felt like we were these Care Bears and we were just staring this love like through our bellies, through our bodies, like from the top of this hill down across the mountain into the ICU. And it was just like, I can't even describe it, but it helped me acknowledge my grief. It didn't make things better. It didn't, my brother came through it, and, we went through a longer kind of grieving journey for other parts of it, but it was just in that moment when I had nothing else to do, I found ritual. It was a ritual walk. We went on this walk. We intentionally created our own meaning, what we needed. And what we didn't need at that day was a long-winded conversation. We knew we needed something different. So yeah.
Thank you. What I'm taking from that, especially with this piece of early grief, I'll speak for myself. I know when I was so unbelievably overwhelmed, and on the days when I'm still overwhelmed, I can't process, I can't strategize, I can't come up with a plan for something that's going to be meaningful most days. It is about what it sounds like from you is that it is about the opportunity to put yourself in a situation where you're open and to let yourself really receive what it is from whatever the environment is around you, from your body and what your body is telling you that you need. And that can flow into and naturally create an opportunity for us to create a ritual. That's what I'm hearing and taking from that.
Yeah, I mean, we've been sold the story that grief is this passive kind of, wait in the shadows kind of thing, that it's there, but you can suppress it. We have these 3 days of bereavement leave, and we're expected to get over grief. We're expected to kind of, get through it so that it's no longer there. And we're meant to kind of don't feel sad, feel joy. Like it's this dichotomy that is so problematic. And one of my favorite rituals, I don't know if I have it here. I have this ritual toolbox that my friend built me with this amazing heron on it. The heron is like and the inside cover is this beautiful kind of forest. Yeah, so a very simple ritual that we created at Be Ceremonial is literally holding your grief and your gratitude at the very same time, because we're told we need to choose. We need told, move through your grief so you can get to your gratitude, or move through your sadness so you can get to your joy. And as an empath, as someone who feels a multitude of emotions in the very same breath, it was always really disconcerting when I was told to choose. I'm like, how do I choose? I'm feeling so many things in this very moment. And so one of my most favorite rituals is to hold my grief in my left hand and close my eyes. And I feel it. I feel how heavy it is that day. I feel how light it is. I feel, is it a color? Is it, prickly? Like, I try to describe my grief inside of myself in my left hand. And then I shake out my hand, and then I hold my gratitude in my right hand for just as long or as many breaths as I need. And again, I picture it in all of its color and weight and smells and sounds. And then I hold them together. And this is for me the state of grace of being able to hold my grief and my gratitude in the same breath and not feel like they need to compete, that they need to replace each other. So I have lots of these there are simple things you can make. I have a beautiful one around silence and quiet. I'm losing my hearing, and I don't know how far it will go, but it's one of those things that the doctors are just confused about. And so I hold the kind of the scary part of losing my hearing, and the beautiful part of what it helps me hear and what it opens up. And yeah, I think finding ways to kind of, we call it holding two truths, that you don't have to hold just one. You can hold these two truths at the very same time.
Thank you for a tangible example of something that we can do, and also for sharing your personal experience of how to take something that could be seemingly simple, that is creating this little, I don't know what you'd call it, an object that you can hold in your hand, but it brings you so much meaning and time to process and sit with something. We were going to spend some time tonight talking through the process of building a ritual. We do have a couple of questions that have come in through the Q&A though, that I would love to answer. And I'm curious,
One stone.
pardon me?
I could do two birds with one stone.
Let's do that then. Do you want to lead then, and I can sort of pass it to you and we can tackle it?
Perfect. Yeah. So somebody's asked about pregnancy loss and rituals connected to that. And again, when we think about kind of a standalone ritual, after my first miscarriage, I found my way down to the beach, and I found these rocks at the beach, and I sat with them for what felt like hours, holding the rock in my hand, noticing the color, the texture. And I had a marker in my pen. And so I sat there and I wrote one word kind of messages to my baby, a name that I'd had in my mind that we would call him or her, a wish that a grief, I chose these words carefully, but I also just wrote them out, and I sat with them for a while. And then I took those rocks and I just threw them as far as I could into the ocean. And it was quite primal. I remember it's all vague, and I think there must have been people around, but I don't remember seeing anyone else. But I threw this rock, and as I released it, I let out this wail, and it was so beautiful. I mean, it's, if you see somebody on the beach doing this, give them some compassion, because I had cried, all day, but I hadn't wailed. And it was just that moment of releasing it and letting some of that go, because there was so much, pregnancy loss is so much more than just the loss of a fetus. There's the loss of the future stories and the expectations and the experiences. And pregnancy and fertility for women is so complicated, because we're told we have this expiration date and we're on this timeline, and the pressure it does inside of you is just very traumatic. So another one that I did for my pregnancy loss after my third miscarriage is I found my way into this special forest that I go, and I wrote down the words that no longer served me. So I wrote down the words timeline, expectations, and perfect. And I had a lighter and some paper in my purse, and I just carefully and safely burned those words and buried the kind of remnants in the soil. And it was for me just such a beautiful acknowledgement of, it doesn't poof go away, you still feel those things, but I acknowledged them, I brought them to the surface, and I burned them, I released them, I tried to let some of that power go, that those words were not defining me. So you can create individual kind of rituals like that, but you can also create a pregnancy loss ceremony. And for me, a ceremony, again, is kind of the way that we've created it. We've created this beautiful online platform to help people create their own ceremonies. And in it, you go through a 5-step kind of process, 5 stages. You choose a ritual to open and a ritual to kind of close your ceremony. And those are often really simple. It might be like using one of the sensory experiences, like lighting a candle or spraying a kind of scent that reminds you of somebody, or just dropping into that ritual mindset. So you kind of bookend your ceremony and you say, okay, now I'm entering the ceremony space. You go through your ceremony, and at the end you choose a closing ritual that says, okay, now I've closed that space and I can step back into my everyday life, because we can't live in a ceremony all the time. It's exhausting. I've tried. But then within the ceremony, so you've kind of got your bookends, your opening and your closing, but then within there, for me, a ceremony is an acknowledgement of what was, what is, and what will be. So I've curated rituals that support people around what was. So a ritual to release from the past, a ritual to let go, a ritual to kind of honor where you've come from. And it's interesting, in some of the weddings that I've done, it's a second marriage for people. So we choose a ritual that honors the fact that they had another marriage before that may have produced children. And so you can't just throw all that away. Like, the beautiful things came from that marriage. And so we have to honor it in that marriage setting. The next stage is what is. So for me, these are the choosing a ritual that grounds you in the moment. So you're not looking back or looking ahead, you're just very present. And ceremony and ritual and mindfulness all share a lot of, things in common, but for me, this is just about noticing where you are in the world. And there's a beautiful one that I do, where you name 5 things that you can see, and 4 things that you can hear, and 3 things that you can touch, and 2 things that you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. And by the end, by the time you've done that 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, you are so present. Like, you are just in your body. You're connected to the earth, the ground, you're connected to the wind around you and the sound of the birds or wherever you find yourself. And then finally, you choose a ritual around what will be. So this is the legacy keeping. So if we think about pregnancy loss, a big part of it for me was, I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if, the next time I get pregnant, will this happen again? Like, it was so much fear. And so I had to create a ritual that would support me for whatever the future would hold. So I wrote a beautiful letter to my future child or children, and I got some beautiful wildflower seeds, and I went out into my garden and I planted it, and I planted it with these seeds, and I watered it and I tended it, and I just knew it was there. And whatever happened, I knew that I was planting something. And for me, that was a really integral part of the ceremony. I didn't want to end on kind of the what was. So thinking about the ceremony and those kind of 5 stages can hopefully help you just think about how you can create that sacred ceremonial space for yourself, acknowledging what was, what is, and what will be.
Thank you for sharing. I think what really stuck out to me in that description in our conversation before this is that, similar to grief, these ceremonies are a process. There's a beginning, there's a middle, everything that's swirling and going on, and there's past, present, future. I'll say personally, I don't believe that there's always an end, but there can be those caps and those milestones, or those periods where you bring yourself into something, you allow yourself to feel it, process it, and then there's a way to sort of tie it and not put a bow on it, but to be able to let yourself out of something and have that intentional, beautiful space to have held for it. So thank you for sharing. I think it's really good to hear a full explanation of that process and the journey through not just a singular piece, which is a ritual that's a part of a larger ceremony.
Yeah. The other question that came up was around, you allude to people moving into the ritual modality following the grieving process. That doesn't seem typical to me, that people know what to do ritually to honor their loved ones. For those for whom ritual is not a natural process, how do you guide them once they seek assistance? That's a great question. Gently. I guide people gently. I work with a lot of grieving families, and I think that holding silence is a ritual. I think that if you're intentional with a moment of silence, it can be one of the most powerful rituals you can offer someone. I have kind of a little mnemonic device that I always come back to. And I talked about earlier the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 of the senses. This is different. This is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but it's just the same idea of choosing one intention. So if we go to create a ritual or a ceremony, you might want it to do a lot of different things. You might want it to help you get through your grief and so bring people together and, heal family ties. And, you might have all of these things that you hope your ceremony will do. And my advice is to come down and boil it down to that one singular intention. So, is it for you? Is it for your family? Is it for your community? Is it to acknowledge and mourn? Is it to celebrate? Like really coming down to that one intention can be a really helpful place to start. The two in that is thinking about the two different kind of emotions that you might be holding. So if it's grief and gratitude or light and dark, like trying to find those seemingly opposing emotions that might be present in your ceremony space and create space for both of them. Let them both sit in that ceremony setting. We talked about ceremony being beautiful, but ceremony can also be like really ugly and hard and sad. Like it's grief, right? It doesn't need to be tied up with that perfect bow. Like it should just kind of have the wailing and the mascara running and like all of the things that are human. The third part of the mnemonic device is finding a way to acknowledge the past, the present, and future, even as simply as taking 3 breaths together as a community. So I often invite people to take 1 breath to acknowledge the person who died, take a breath to acknowledge yourself in this present moment, and then we all take a breath together to acknowledge the community that's coming together or how we're going to step into tomorrow. And that simple process of taking 3 intentional breaths as a community, it connects you. We're now breathing the same air. Our nervous systems have kind of regulated, and we're able to have that next kind of step into the ceremony. The fourth part is bringing in the 4 elements in some way. So fire, earth, water, air. Air is obviously breath or music, lighting a candle through fire, bringing in water in some way, whether it's, just bringing out a bowl of water and inviting people to drop some little salt in it for each story that they're honoring and create this big, beautiful bowl of salt water that holds the stories of the family or of the person. And earth. So just, choosing some whether it's grounding yourself or choosing a rock nearby or a shell or a pine cone, something that you find nearby and holding that in your hand. I call them grief talisman. So it's like a grief sponge almost, like bring your grief into that object and hold it and acknowledge and honor what you're feeling. And then 5 is the 5 sensory experiences. So find a way to bring in the idea of scent or taste or touch, or, have everybody drink the same cup of tea at the same moment and have that connecting experience. Or, if your mom loved chocolate ice cream, like invite chocolate ice cream into your ceremony setting and honor her as you do. So that's my advice there.
That's a lot. Thank you for offering so much. Like, it's just, thank you so much for offering such practical tips and also just so many ideas that I think can spark so much for so many of us. My mom didn't love chocolate ice cream, but she loved red vines. And someone opened a box of red vines for the first time I've seen since I've been around my mom about a week ago. And I let myself sit with them and eat more than I would ever eat. And even just now I'm thinking, how can I incorporate that as something special and beautiful between us to bond us and to trigger those memories and not holding of space for my mom within my life right now. So think that something about the little ice cream comment you made at the end just really sat for me. Like, that is my being able to bring in those senses in so many different ways is really special. Thank you.
Yeah, I lost a friend when I was 21, and it was my first big loss. The first death of somebody close to me that was my age, and we listened to Alanis Morissette's Jagged Little Pill growing up. That was like our song, and we would or the album, and just play it. And for years, I would hear that album or a song, and I would just turn it off immediately. And again, it was like seeing my father-in-law, like I would just shut it down. But now when I'm like thinking about her, I literally go to my Spotify playlist and I find that song and I turn it up and I just dance and I sing and I lip sync and I feel her with me. And that for me is just such a beautiful gift to be able to invite people into our lives even after they've gone.
Thank you. That's beautiful. And also really, I think, lovely note to end this conversation on. But I just want to offer you some space at the end of our time now to hear from you. I want to thank everyone for joining tonight, but to hear from you about offerings or anything that you would like to offer to the community that's here tonight, in terms of the work that you do and everything you have going on. You just had a launch, which I was going to let you talk about, but I'm also just like, yay, please. So yeah, I'd love to hear before we leave for the night, just about anything coming up for you that you feel called to share.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, COVID kind of threw a wrench in our lives. My husband lost his job 2 or 3 weeks in. He was in a tech travel startup, so not really where you want to be in a global pandemic. But it gave us the opportunity to, he's a software engineer, to really, come together as a couple, as, partners and say, what do we want to build? What do we wish we had access to when we were going through and continue to go through this deep, murky, muddy waters of grief? And we have built an online platform and soon to be app in the App Store called Be Ceremonial. And it's centered for now around the two thresholds, so birth and death. We've got ceremonies surrounding IVF and infertility and pregnancy loss and the pregnancy journey and breastfeeding and how you start and stop breastfeeding and reaching that first year. We kind of focus there. And then we've got the end of life experience, from terminal diagnosis to rituals that can support someone nearing death, and then immediately following death, and then into the legacy keeping. So celebrations of life and memorials and death anniversaries. I worked a lot with people who turn the age that their loved one was when their loved one died, and how do you create a ceremony around that day? So we've taken everything we've learned and everything we continue to learn, and we've placed it into this beautiful app called Be Ceremonial. Primarily, it's for care providers to support their patients and clients with. So we've got a lot of birth doulas and end of life doulas and funeral directors and those types of people. But we also recently launched a personal account. So that gives anybody the opportunity to come in and have a free trial and try it out and see if it can help support you in your journey. Somebody asked in the questions about friendship, and oh, this is so big and like important to me. And we're actually crafting a course called Friendship Rituals that will pay more importance and attention to how we move into and out of friendship, because it's a big and visible kind of moment in our lives. And those will be coming into the app as we develop this course as well. So how we end friendships and how we can create ceremonies around that, either on our own or together if you have that kind of friendship. But that for me is a really important one, because friendships are a huge part of my life, and the ones that I've lost over the years, I still have that kind of that grief that resonates. So yeah, that's we also run the end of life ritual training course, and we're going to be putting more courses up in the fall, making them as accessible as we can to people. We offer scholarships and sliding scale pricing, and really I'm just inspired by all of the stories I hear from everyone who is stepping toward our grief and not shutting it into a little box and putting it in a closet. I think that the more we can shift the narrative and change the story around what it looks like to grieve, what it looks like to die, what it looks like to honor somebody after they've gone, I think that we'll all have I don't know, a more holistic and healthy existence if we can just name those invisible moments for what they are and support each other in those times.
Thank you. I agree. That's why I'm doing this work. I think the importance of people like you sharing your story and your work, talking about grief so openly in a way that is honest, results in people sharing so many things like they did tonight, this was helpful, this was inspiring. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So I just want to say again, thank you, Megan, for joining me for this conversation. Obviously I had my tears, and that was really helpful for me tonight. And in general, just I'm so grateful for your work and your time. And we are going to keep hosting these, but in this moment right now, I'm just I'm holding a lot of gratitude for this conversation tonight.
Yeah, and I think we're all drawn to conversations like this for a reason, because it's just been so taboo and so kind of that gray area. And I'm just really excited by the amount I've seen all the people's comments and people joining and those who might be watching the recording later. I just think that if we're going to change the story, it's going to take a big group of us to kind of really shift that narrative. So yeah, I'm always open to connect and chat further. And thank you, Elisa, for doing the work that you're doing and for just creating space for all of this to happen.
Of course, of course. That's what I'm here for. So thank you. Thank you everyone who joined tonight and who's watching this later. To join me for more events, you can check them out. You'll be getting emails about them now that you're on the list. We've thrown all of Megan's information and websites, contact info, everything in the chat. And it will also be going out in an email, and it will also be in materials that we create after this event. So you will not miss ways to get in touch. Thank you again for this. Thank you, Kaylee, for supporting this evening and just always. So yeah, super grateful for this. And I hope everyone takes care and has a lovely evening tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.